I am here in the heart of Europe, in Brussels, to be speaking to Frederik Mennes at OneSpan. He's the Director of Strategy and has a very wide range of knowledge, from deep technical cryptography to rules and regulation. So with someone as knowledgeable as him, I'm sure that we can have an amazing conversation on PSD3. Welcome to a new episode of Fusion Fireside. Frederik, you were trained as a cryptographer, so you have some technical skills, I would presume, and some mathematical skills and some knowledge of the deeper underlying principles of some of the stuff that we are putting out there in cybersecurity every day. So how does it help you in your daily work to have that deep technical understanding of the underlying algorithms and principles?
Yes, very nice to meet you, Ewart, today. My background is actually in computer science engineering initially. So my foundations are in computer science. And during my computer science education, I took some elective courses about computer security, secure software development, cryptography. And I liked it so much that I decided to spend an additional full year studying information security, as it was called at that time, in London. And as part of that, I had quite a few elective courses also about cryptography and more advanced topics in cryptography, which I really liked very much. Here at OneSpan nowadays, in my current role as Director of Strategy, I'm not that often using cryptography anymore as a tool, but it's definitely something very useful to understand how the market is evolving, how we need to adapt our products to the market, to the needs of our customers. So a technical background, in my view, is really very important in order to be able to understand our business and to be able to drive our business going forward. Yes.
Yeah, and that makes sense because in the old days it was all about key sizes, right? We went from 1024 to 2048 and so on, doubling the key sizes. Yeah. And then came quantum, didn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, quantum computers are probably coming. I think we have to be a little bit prudent still when we talk about quantum technology, quantum computers in particular. They are here today, but with very limited capabilities. You can do very simple calculations with them nowadays, but we are still far from quantum computers that are capable of actually breaking our existing cryptographic algorithms with the key sizes that you mentioned.
Yeah. That makes sense. So the realm of the hypothetical and the realm of the, let's say today, the feasible and scalable technology, that's really far apart yet.
When it comes to quantum, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear a lot in the news about the upcoming quantum computers, but as of today, I don't think we can do anything useful with them, and let alone that we can break the existing cryptographic algorithms with the traditional key sizes. So that's still a little bit early. Maybe if we do an interview again in 10 years, the situation will be different. Who knows?
So it's in the calendar.
Okay.
As we speak today, in 10 years, we're going to have another conversation on this, as far as I'm concerned. But so another thing in 10 years that might be completely different is, of course, how society is dealing with all this technology. And I was wondering, from your deep technical background, how did you end up being so knowledgeable on rule and regulations? Because that's what you are as well.
Yes, I mean, the discussion today is indeed not about cryptography, unfortunately, but about legislation. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a legal background. That's fully right. But I just became interested in legislation, and especially legislation related to fraud detection, legislation related to strong authentication of digital banking users, because the legislation is so important for the business in which we are. And the legislation is really defining minimum security requirements, minimum requirements that all banks and therefore also the suppliers of cybersecurity technology to banks have to adhere to. So yeah, I think I became interested in legislation because it's really so important for our business. And also when we talk to customers, it really helps that you understand their background, you understand their reasoning, and that is also often based on regulatory compliance, amongst many other things, of course.
So would it be true to say that there are completely two ends of the spectrum, but they are definitely meeting in the middle somewhere, right? And
yes.
Sometimes, if you're blind for one side of the spectrum, that might, evoke you to make mistakes on the other end, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, one of the nice things about the profession of information security, cybersecurity, that it is so broad. You can discuss about bits and bytes in cryptography and in implementations in software or hardware, but you can also talk about legislation at the very other end of the spectrum. And for me, that actually makes it interesting as a profession to be active in.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the pivotal moments is upon us, right? Is because with regards to payment security and consumer protection in Europe, a lot is changing, or let's say evolving. Let's dive into that later. But I guess it might also mean that for the world, things are changing, because in essence, everyone that wants to deal with Europe, for them, any upcoming regulations are relevant as well. So just a few weeks ago, you just mentioned to me that the PSD3 has come to the final political negotiations.
Yep.
So is there anything that had changed with those final negotiations?
Yeah, so the process towards PSD3 and the Payment Services Regulation, or PSR as we call it, started already 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. Back in June 2023, the European Commission made its first proposal. And so now, almost 3 years later, about 2 weeks ago, we are December 9th today, to make it clear for everyone, just about 2 weeks ago, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council, they reached a political agreement about the most important requirements in the Payment Services Regulation. That doesn't mean that the PSR text is finished. It's not yet the case, but it means that now the so-called technical trilogue discussions between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament continue, and we expect the final text to become available in the beginning of next year. Let's say March of 2026 at the latest. But some things have leaked or have been announced about the content of this political agreement from the end of November. One very important item that became public is the liability scheme that will be used in the PSR. And liability means who is responsible to pay when there is a fraud case in a digital payment or in digital banking. In the UK, for instance, the banks are always liable for this, and they are liable for all types of so-called authorized push payment fraud, so all kinds of social engineering scams, but with a cap of 85,000 British pounds. So it was interesting to see what would be ultimately decided for the European Union. And I have to be a little bit prudent here because, again, not all the details have been published yet. But what has been announced is that banks will have the primary liability for a certain type of authorized push payment fraud, namely the so-called bank impersonation scams. So if a fraudster impersonates an employee of a bank or impersonates the bank as an institution, and this leads to fraud, well, in that case, the victim would not be held liable, but the bank would be held liable, meaning that the bank would refund the victim.
And so in the UK, they make a differentiation between the sending bank and the receiving bank. Do they do that in PSD3 as well?
No, that's not an element in PSD3. So it's really the bank that is liable for bank impersonation scams.
So it's the bank where the money is moved from.
Yeah. But very importantly, and this is also a major difference with the United Kingdom, in Britain, all types of APP scams fall under the liability of the bank, while in Europe it will only be the bank impersonation scams.
Yeah.
And that's really a very important difference.
Yes, because let's say, from experience, a tech impersonation scam and a bank impersonation scam, they're very similar in nature.
Yes.
So if they impersonate Microsoft, they would not be liable.
That's right. I mean, there is a lot to discuss about this. Why limited to banks? Why limited to impersonation scams? Why not include other scams like purchase scams, investment scams, romance scams, you name it?
Yeah.
You can discuss about that for a very long time, and that's also the discussion that the Commission and the Parliament had amongst themselves. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because going back 2 steps is because you understand technology and you understand the regulatory side of this. It's difficult to speak the same language, right? I bet some anti-fraud experts are scratching their heads as to why certain types of fraud are being, let's say, subject to liability and others aren't. But also, they might, for example, say, well, if you're a victim of a scam, just say the bank called, even if it wasn't so, right? So it gets you on slippery ice, if you will.
Yes, it will definitely be a gray area, and there will undoubtedly be discussions about, okay, does this fall under the definition of bank impersonation or not? I think ultimately banks wanted to avoid that they became liable for all types of scams in Europe. So at the moment, under what we expect to be in PSD3, they take on liability for fraud that is somehow related to digital banking or digital payments. There will definitely be a gray zone.
Well, and that makes sense as well, right? Is you can't, because you're part of this system, doesn't mean you're responsible for everything that happens within said system.
Absolutely.
So there's boundaries somewhere. So and I guess the aim of the regulation is to find the boundaries in a fair and honest way. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to add a very important second item about liability. It's not only the banks that will ultimately carry the liability. Fraud very often originates outside of a digital banking application. It usually originates on a social media platform. I think we all know them. So what the European institutions have decided, have agreed that banks will be able to transfer the liability to another party, social media platforms, telecommunications providers, if the fraud started there, if the fraud originated there. And I think that's actually fair. So if you look at statistics indicating where fraud originated, well, you see that more than 75% of APP fraud actually originated on social media platforms or via SMS messages. I think it makes a lot of sense that the European institutions have foreseen this possibility to transfer liability. And this is a major difference with the UK. In the UK, this possibility does not exist, actually.
Yeah. So is there a resemblance with some of the other regulations? For example, Australian regulation speaks a little bit more about tech liability than the UK regulations, for example. Do you see parallels there?
Absolutely. I think Australia is a very good example of a country that has already introduced legislation, and well, it carries elements from both the United Kingdom. Australia is part of the Commonwealth, but it's also similar to the European Union in the sense that they also allow banks to transfer liability to other parties, including, amongst other, social media platforms and telecommunications providers. So that's, in that way, Australia is indeed very similar.
Interesting. So another interesting thing I'm thinking in the UK is the limit of £85,000 sterling.
Yeah.
Is there such a limit defined in PSD3?
No, there is no limit at the moment, and I don't think it will come either. So the full amount of the fraud experienced by the victim, let's say, is the amount that would need to be refunded by the bank, first of all, and then perhaps later by, let's say, the social media provider.
Yeah. So are there other specifics that have been decided on that might be interesting to discuss here?
I think the liability is probably the most important element that was present in the press releases following the political agreement. But we can certainly discuss some of the preventive measures, measures to prevent fraud that will most likely, I say most likely, be present in the final text. Liability only comes into play when there has been a fraud case. And PSD3 actually, first of all, wants to prevent the fraud. So we can certainly talk about that as well, if you want.
Exactly. So it's supposed to be an incentive for PSPs to protect their customers against fraud.
Absolutely. The fact that banks or payment service providers more generally are held liable or will be held liable and will have financial consequences in terms of fraud will provide incentives to them to invest in fraud detection, fraud prevention, technology, and other countermeasures to prevent the fraud in the first place.
Yeah. And so I'm guessing they don't mention specific technologies, or are they going into detail on those parts? What do they think what does good look like according to the committee?
Yeah, it's very broad. I think one of the countermeasures is not even technical. It's about user education. It's about awareness. And I think it's fair that probably the strongest protection against fraud is better user awareness, making sure people think twice or even 3 times when they are involved in very strange activity, when they receive a message from Brad Pitt asking them for money. Maybe they should think twice instead of just responding to that inquiry. So there is a lot of focus on user education, awareness, but also on more technical controls.
So does PSD3 actually speak about technical measures that PSP can implement to protect their consumers?
Yes, indeed. That's also a very important part of the PSD3 legislation, besides liability and besides the importance of user education and awareness. So, for example, PSD3 requires all payment service providers to provide something called verification of payee or confirmation of payee. In the Netherlands, this is already very common practice since many years, but in many other European countries, including Belgium, this didn't exist until recently. So all payment service providers under PSD3 will be required to implement verification of payee. So checking whether a bank account number matches the name of a beneficiary when initiating a payment. Besides that, transaction monitoring will need a refresher as well. Transaction monitoring was already present under PSD2, but PSD3 emphasizes the importance of including behavioral intelligence as well as device intelligence or environmental intelligence into the transaction monitoring systems of payment service providers. behavioral intelligence and device intelligence are really key signals to detect and to prevent various impersonation scams. So these are some of the examples of technical measures that also need to be implemented.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've studied multiple times during the evolution of the let's say the PSD3 in progress, how it's evolved. I think one of the interesting things is that the last iteration of the PSD was the PSD2.
Yep.
I think it's already 12, 13 years ago that it came out. I was an anti-fraud back then as well. And that one was very much focused on opening up banking to fintechs and creating a competitive environment for fintechs.
Yep.
Those were some of the big takeaways. This one is more focused about protecting consumers. So how do you see that evolution? Does it fit, let's say, in the zeitgeist, or is it logical that it goes that way?
Yeah, it seems like we have another PSD every decade or so. We had PSD1, I think, in 2009, then PSD2 in the previous decade, and now in the 2020s we will have the PSR. Maybe in the 2030s we will have the PSR2, etc. But indeed, I mean, legislation is usually a response to things that happened earlier. Technological evolutions, fraud evolutions. As you mentioned, PSD2 was basically about introducing open banking in a formal way into the European Union. And it was also about protecting digital banking and digital payment systems against account takeover fraud, which was the big problem at that time. Account takeover fraud means stealing credentials of the victim and then logging into the victim's account with these credentials. And strong customer authentication was the answer to that problem, to that question of ATO fraud. Now in the 2020s, fraud has evolved. Also under pressure of PSD2, I believe, fraud evolved. And the main type of fraud that we now see in digital banking or digital payments is what we call authorized push payment fraud, or APP fraud, with a lot of examples.
Scams. In some parts of the world.
Yeah. Scams like impersonation scams, investment scams, etc. And the right answer to this type of fraud, these scams, is not only strong customer authentication. You need to do more. You have to look at better fraud detection, fraud prevention, and that's also what we see now in the PSR. There are various countermeasures in there to help banks and other PSPs protect against this type of scams.
So we're sitting here in Brussels. So not too far as the bird flies from here is the SWIFT headquarters in La Hulpe. We have had SEPA since 2008. And now we are about to have PSD3 to protect consumers and incentivize fraud prevention. How are we doing in Europe? Do you think that we're on the right track?
So if we look globally, Europe pays a lot of attention to curbing fraud, especially if you compare it with North America. We pay much more attention to curbing fraud, especially at the regulatory level. When we compare Europe against Asia Pacific, for instance, I think we're in a very similar situation. The financial regulators in Asia Pacific, let's say Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, they also pay a lot of attention to limiting fraud via regulatory mechanisms. So Europe and Asia Pacific are very similar. Regulators have similar powers, I would say. North America has more the laissez-faire attitude. They leave it to the markets, and it's up to the banks to take care of the fraud in the way that they want to do it. I mean, more or less, I'm exaggerating. There is some regulation, but there is definitely no regulation in North America related to preventing APP fraud at the moment, for example.
Yeah. So PSD3 obviously is going to impact anyone working in PSP in Europe or headquartered in Europe or even with branch offices in Europe.
Yeah.
But very likely anyone that wants to do business in Europe is going to be impacted in some way as well. So would it be fair to say that PSD3 has an impact to the entire world?
Yes, I mean, the impact of PSD3 will certainly not be limited to, let's say, the European Union or the European Economic Area. We saw the same with PSD2. It has much broader effects also on financial institutions that are doing business in the European Union. For instance, Japanese banks that have a subsidiary within the European Union, they will also look at PSD2. They looked at PSD2 in the past. But even companies or banks that do not have business in the European Union will just look at the legislation because many legislators outside Europe actually are inspired by what we do here in Europe. For example, the legislators in the Middle East, in Africa, and beyond, they will also look at the PSD3 legislation and see how they can adjust their own legislation to be more in line with what we do.
Yeah. So that also means that there's a huge responsibility to the people building PSD3, because if they get it wrong, so to say, that will be an inspiration for the rest of the world. So is there anything anyone can do right now to influence the final stages of the writing of the regulation, or is it all set in stone now?
It's not set in stone yet. So at the moment, the technical trilogues, so the technical discussions between the representatives of the European Commission, Council and Parliament are taking place. And these people certainly still talk to other parties. They still speak with representatives of banks. They still speak with representatives of consumer organizations. They speak with representatives of cybersecurity vendors. So these discussions continue, and I think that's actually healthy. It's important for the legislators to receive feedback from all the parties that will be influenced or impacted by their work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my last question is really about, this is going to be a big thing, obviously, for yourself and myself working in fraud prevention. I work mostly for European banks. It's going to be a huge thing. But after we finalize this, after this regulation is finalized, what's now going to be the next thing in your mind that regulators should focus on? Are there big gaping holes caused by the state of technology evolution that need to be addressed next?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when the PSD3 text is finished, that's only the first step in the PSD3 process. Because there will be, I think, about 15 to 20 additional texts developed by the European Banking Authority, which specify the requirements of the, let's say, first level PSD3 text in more detail. So we're certainly not done yet when the PSD3 text is final. Having said that, let's suppose PSD3 is all done, all the additional texts have been written, then we will probably be okay for 5 years or something. But undoubtedly, in the 2030s, we will have PSR2 or PSD4, whatever. And you can already see gaps today that will most likely need to be addressed. Just one example, we all see the advent of so-called AI agents. Software applications that basically perform a lot of tasks on behalf of users, like making payments, purchasing services or goods via an e-commerce website. So AI agents are not mentioned in PSD3. This will be something that needs to be tackled in the upcoming legislation. How do you apply strong customer authentication to an AI agent, for example? Which fraud detection mechanisms can be used when everything is automated by AI agents and you cannot look at the behavior of the user anymore to detect fraud? So I think these are all questions that we can ask today, and we will need to address them in legislation in the future at some time.
So it seems that, like, just the same for us as it is for the legislators, our work is never going to be done.
In this area, no. I think there is still a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, Frederik, thank you very much for this conversation on PSD3 and PSR. For Thread Fabric, this is Ewart Driehuis. If you want to see more episodes of Fusion Fireside, go to www.threadfabric.com/fusion-fireside.